The night has a voice, doesn't it? A low, rhythmic hum that only reveals itself when the world finally stops its shouting. You are here because you are seeking that specific kind of silence. The kind that doesn't just quiet the room, but settles the storm inside your own chest. For over 1,000 years, Zen masters have whispered secrets into the dark, not to give you more things to think about, but to help you unlearn the heavy burdens you've carried all day. Tonight, we aren't just telling stories, we are turning keys in ancient locks. As you sink deeper into your pillow, let the boundaries of your room dissolve. Imagine the mountain air of ancient Japan, cool and scented with cedar, pressing against your skin. We begin with a man who carried a sword, but could not find peace. Nobushika was a samurai of the highest order, a man whose life was measured in duty and the sharp edge of his katana.
Yet as he climbed the winding stone path to the monastery of Master Hakuin, his heart was a battlefield. He didn't come for combat, he came for an answer. He stood before the old monk, his armor clanking softly in the temple's hush, and demanded to know, is there truly a heaven and a hell? Hakuin looked at him, not with the reverence one gives a warrior, but with the pity one gives a fool. The master's voice was like a lash. You, a soldier? Your face looks like that of a beggar. What ruler would want such a pathetic guard? The insult was a spark in a powder keg. Nobushiga's blood turned to fire. His hand flew to his hilt, and as the steel sang out of its scabbard, he raised the blade to strike the monk down. In that split second, as the samurai's face twisted with murderous rage, Hakuin spoke with the stillness of a deep lake. Here, he whispered, open the gates of hell. The blade stopped mid-air. The words pierced through the samurai's fury like a lantern in a cave. He saw it. The hell wasn't a place under the earth. It was the fire in his own veins, the cage he had built with his own pride. He sheathed his sword and bowed, his forehead touching the cold floor in sudden, trembling humility. And here, Hakuin added with a voice like silk, open the gates of paradise. Take a breath with him now. Feel that same gate opening in you. The anger, the worry about tomorrow, the replays of today's mistakes, those are the gates of hell. You can choose to sheathe the sword. You can choose to bow to the moment. Because as the Buddha taught, you aren't punished for your anger, you are punished by it. It burns the hand that holds it long before it ever reaches its target. But life isn't always a dramatic confrontation on a temple floor. Sometimes it's a quiet theft in the heat of a summer noon. Imagine a weary merchant, his shoulders aching from the weight of 50 rolls of fine cotton. He finds shade beneath a roadside shelter where a stone Buddha sits in eternal meditation. The merchant sleeps, trusting the silence of the stone. But when he wakes, the cotton is gone. His life's work vanished into the shimmering heat. He runs to Judge Uka, a man whose wisdom was as sharp as a winter frost. The judge listens, and then, with a face as serious as a funeral, declares the culprit. The stone Buddha. He failed his duty to protect the goods. Arrest the statue at once. Can you hear the laughter of the townspeople? They followed the guards, mocking the foolish judge as the heavy stone was hauled into the courtroom. The room was a circus of giggles and whispers, but Uka slammed his gavel. This is a court of law, he thundered. Your laughter is a contempt of justice.
Every person here is fined 1 roll of cotton to be delivered within 3 days. The laughter died. The people, fearing the law, brought their rolls. And there, hidden among the common cloth, the merchant found his own unique weave. The thief, caught in a net of his own making, was revealed. You see, the direct path is often a wall,
But the indirect path, the one that looks absurd to the logical mind, is where the truth hides. We get so trapped in how things should be that we forget how things could be if we only had the courage to look foolish. Now, listen to the rhythmic thud of marching boots. An imperial army division is maneuvers in the mountains, and they seek shelter at the temple of Master Gasson. The officers are men of status, decorated with gold and ego. They expect a feast. Instead, they are served the same thin soup and plain rice as the monks. One officer, his pride bristling like a porcupine, confronts Gasson.
"We are soldiers of the Emperor," he barks. "We sacrifice our lives for this country. Why do you treat us like common beggars?"
Gasson didn't flinch. He looked through the officer, past the uniform, to the soul beneath. "And who do you think we are?" he asked. "We are the soldiers of humanity. You fight for a border, a name, a temporary throne. We fight to liberate every heart from suffering. Your battlefield is a map. Ours is the human spirit." The officer's anger evaporated. How small his medals felt in the shadow of a mission that spanned lifetimes. Ask yourself tonight, what army are you serving? The army of your own small ego, or the greater service of kindness to every soul you meet? Even the most powerful man in the land, Emperor Goyoz, found himself a student of the shadows. He sat on silk cushions, surrounded by the finest scholars. Yet, he was hungry for a truth that books couldn't feed. He summoned Master Gudo. "Master," the emperor asked, "where does an enlightened man go when he dies?" "I know not," Gudo replied. The emperor was stunned. "You are a great master. How can you not know?" "Because," Gudo said with a small, knowing smile, "I have not died yet." It's a simple honesty, isn't it? We spend our lives building elaborate theories about the afterlife, about the future, about the next thing, while the now sits unobserved. Suddenly, Gudo struck the floor with his palm, a sharp, sudden crack that echoed through the palace. In that vibration, the emperor's thoughts shattered. For a heartbeat, there was no emperor, no palace, no questions, only the sound, only the presence. He was enlightened not by an answer, but by the destruction of the question. As you drift closer to the edge of sleep, consider the warrior Nonaga. He stood before a battle where he was outnumbered 10 to 1. His men were ghosts of fear, their spirits already defeated. Nonaga stopped at a shrine and pulled a coin from his sleeve. "If it is heads, we win. If it is tails, we lose. Let destiny decide." He flipped it high. It caught the sun, a spinning silver promise. Heads. The army roared. They fought like lions, convinced that the universe itself had signed their victory. After the slaughter, an attendant whispered, "No one can change the hand of fate." Nonaga smiled and showed him the coin. It had heads on both sides. We are the architects of our own destiny, but we are also the victims of our own beliefs. The coin didn't change the battle. It changed the minds of the men holding the swords. What tales are you afraid of tonight? What if you realize the coin was always in your favor? If only you changed the story you told yourself about the odds. The night is deepening now. The stories are beginning to weave together, forming a bridge between the world you know and the world that waits for you in the silence. But there is a deeper layer to this silence, one that involves the very thing we are doing right now, the act of teaching, of listening, of being. Master Gasson once sat with his disciples and spoke of the greatest sin. They expected him to talk of violence or theft. Instead, he spoke of killing time. He spoke of the person who preaches without enlightenment, saying they are killing Buddhism itself. It's a haunting thought, isn't it? That we can harm the world just by being hollow. But even a master can find himself hollow in the wrong light. Take Master Kassan, a man of immense reputation in his mountain retreat. He was asked to perform a funeral for a great lord, a ceremony filled with the highborn and the powerful. And in that room of silk and judgment, the great Zen master began to sweat.
Not from the heat, but from the pressure of being watched. He finished the rite, but he did not return to his throne. He told his students, "I am not fit to lead you. I have the bearing of a master in a forest, but the heart of a child in a palace." He left for 8 years to study with another, to find the sameness that doesn't care if it's in a hut or a throne room. We all have that sweat, don't we? That fear that our peace is only a product of our comfort. But what happens when the comfort is stripped away? What happens when the stone you think is outside your mind is actually the very weight you've been carrying inside your skull all along? That stone is the heavy burden of identity, the rigid architecture of who we think we are and what we believe we deserve from the world. It is a weight that military boots can never march away, and that no rank can ever truly lighten. Consider the officers of the Imperial Army who once brought their martial energy into the quiet mountains near Master Gassan's temple. They were men of iron and protocol, their uniforms pressed and decorated with insignia that shouted their importance to the wind. During their maneuvers, they sought shelter within the weathered wood and ancient pines of Gassan's monastery, expecting the same deferential treatment they received in the cities, the finest rooms, the richest foods, the deepest bows. They saw themselves as the shields of the nation, the elite servants of the emperor, and they carried that self-importance like a shield. But the mountain does not recognize medals, and the Zen heart does not bow to gold braid. Master Gassan received them with a politeness that was as thin and clear as mountain water, offering them no special ceremony. When the first meal was served, the officers stared in disbelief at their bowls.
There was no succulent meat, no elaborate delicacies befitting their status. Instead, they found only plain rice, a few pickled vegetables, a thin soup, and weak tea. The same humble fare the monks ate every day in their pursuit of stillness. Day after day, the frustration of these men grew. They felt insulted, not by a spoken word, but by the simple reality of being treated as ordinary. Finally, one senior officer, his pride bristling like an unsheathed blade, confronted the master. He stood rigid, his voice trembling with a controlled fury as he demanded to know why they were being fed like common beggars. "Who do you think we are?" he barked. "We are soldiers of the Imperial Army, risking our lives for our country and our emperor. We sacrifice everything for Japan. Why do you treat us with such disregard?" The master did not flinch. He did not apologize. He simply looked into the soldier's eyes with a calm so profound, it seemed to swallow the officer's anger whole. With a voice that held the weight of the mountain itself, he asked, "And who do you think we are?" "We are soldiers of humanity, aiming to save all sentient beings." In that moment, the officer's prepared arguments crumbled. The master went on to explain that while the army fought for a single nation, for temporary political lines drawn in the dirt, and for an emperor who was but a man, the monks fought a battle that spanned lifetimes. They fought for the liberation of every form of consciousness from the cycle of suffering. Their battlefield was not a valley or a ridge, but the human heart itself. The officer realized then that his sacrifice, while noble in a worldly sense, was limited by geography and time, whereas the service of the monk was as boundless as the sky. We often find ourselves trapped in this same hierarchy of importance, believing that our specific roles, parent, professional, leader, earn us a special seat at the table of life. We tie our self-worth to external recognition, and when the world fails to reflect back the importance we feel, we suffer. We open those gates of hell we spoke of earlier, fueled by the ego's demand for preferential treatment. But from the perspective of the Dharma, the value of any action lies not in its social status, but in the purity of the motivation behind it. A parent raising a child with the awareness of their connection to all life is performing a service as grand as any general's victory. When we serve from a place of genuine love, the need for recognition dissolves. The service becomes its own reward, and the heavy stone of the self begins to feel lighter, as if the very air were helping us carry it.
This struggle with identity and the desire for certainty often leads us to seek out knowledge as if it were a possession, something to be hoarded and displayed. We see this in the story of Emperor Gyoze, a man who sat upon the most powerful throne in Japan, surrounded by the finest scholars and the most intricate silk screens painted with cranes and cherry blossoms. Despite his absolute power, the emperor felt a persistent, gnawing hunger for an understanding that his books could not provide. He had heard of Master Gudo, a man known for a directness that could shatter the most complex philosophical systems with a single sentence. The emperor invited the elderly monk to the palace, setting aside a quiet chamber of tatami mats and low tables, hoping to finally grasp the secret of Zen. During one of their sessions, the emperor, leaning forward in his royal robes, asked a question that had haunted his meditations. "Master, I have studied the teachings, and they say that this very mind is Buddha. Is this understanding correct?" It was a trap of the intellect, a desire for a yes or a no that would allow the emperor to check a box and move on to the next concept. But Gudo was not a merchant of concepts. He looked at the most powerful man in the land and replied with a disarming softness. "Your Majesty, if I say yes, you will think you understand without truly understanding. If I say no, I would be contradicting a fact which you may actually know quite well." The emperor was left in the space between, a place where his titles and his learning offered him no footing. He was being asked to step beyond the words into the experience itself. On another afternoon, as the golden light filtered through the palace screens, the emperor tried again, reaching for the ultimate mystery. "Master, where does the enlightened man go when he dies? What becomes of the one who has achieved perfect understanding?" He expected a map of the afterlife, a description of some celestial realm or a state of eternal void. Gudo simply whispered, "I know not." The emperor was startled, perhaps even a bit offended. How could this world-renowned master, this teacher of teachers, admit to such fundamental ignorance? "Why don't you know?" the emperor pressed. Gudo smiled, a look of complete honesty on his weathered face, and said, "Because I have not died yet." This is the radical honesty of Zen. It is the willingness to stand in the not knowing without reaching for a comforting lie. The emperor's rational mind was reeling. He was looking for a teacher who would give him answers, but he had found a teacher who was systematically taking his answers away. He sat in a confused, heavy silence, his mind spinning like a wheel in the mud. Suddenly, without warning, Gudo struck the floor sharply with his hand. The sound cracked through the quiet chamber like a bolt of lightning, shattering the emperor's mental fog. In that instant of shock,
the emperor's conceptual processing stopped. There was no I, no emperor, no afterlife, and no Buddha. There was only the sound, the floor, and the immediate, vibrant presence of the moment. In that flash of startled awareness, he saw it. He understood what cannot be understood through thinking. He grasped what cannot be grasped through words. He was enlightened. Why is it that we are so afraid of saying, "I don't know"?
Our world rewards the confident answer, the quick fix, the expert opinion. We are taught from childhood that ignorance is a failure, a gap that must be filled with information as quickly as possible. But in the spiritual life, "I don't know" is often the most sacred place we can inhabit. It is the fertile soil from which genuine wisdom grows. When we admit we don't know, we stop projecting our old ideas onto the world and start seeing it as it truly is. The emperor had to lose his scholarly certainty before he could find his Buddha nature. He had to stop being the expert on Zen to finally become a student of reality. As the years passed, the emperor's respect for Gudo deepened into a quiet, profound love. He watched as the master grew old and frail. Sometimes, during a lecture in the palace, the ancient teacher would simply fall asleep in the middle of a sentence, his head nodding as his body succumbed to the fatigue of age.
In those moments, the emperor did not feel insulted or disappointed. He would quietly signal for the court to retire, ensuring that his beloved teacher could rest undisturbed, free from the rigid protocols of the throne. He had learned that the truth was not in the words Gudo spoke, but in the quality of the silence that remained when the words stopped. He had learned that the enlightened man doesn't need to be a hero or a scholar. He only needs to be fully present, whether he is striking the floor or drifting into a nap. The Buddha taught that we should not believe anything simply because we have heard it, or because it is written in a book, or even because it comes from a respected teacher. We must test it against our own experience, like a goldsmith tests the purity of metal. This is the difference between intellectual knowledge and direct realization. Knowledge is something you add to yourself, like a heavy coat you wear to impress others. Realization is something you become, a transformation that changes the very way you breathe and move through the world. The emperor initially sought Zen as a scholar, looking for information to store in his memory. But Gudo showed him that enlightenment is not the combination of learning. It is the stripping away of everything that is not true, until only the essential remains. Think for a moment about the questions that keep you awake at night, the worries about the future, the regrets of the past, the search for meaning in a world that often feels chaotic. How many of those questions are like the emperor's, seeking a conceptual answer to a mystery that can only be lived? We harm ourselves with our own thoughts, tying our worth to how much we think we understand or how much others recognize our expertise. We are like the warriors who find pleasure in their swords, or the kings who find pleasure in their kingdoms, always looking for something external to validate our existence. But the wise find pleasure in meditation, which is simply the act of resting in that direct awareness, beyond the need for answers, beyond the need for labels. When you can rest comfortably in uncertainty, you become available to insights that lie far beyond the reach of the thinking mind. You start to see that the battlefield Gaston spoke of is always right here, in the way you respond to a cold meal, a difficult question, or a moment of unexpected silence. You begin to realize that you don't need to go anywhere or become anyone else to find the peace you crave. It is already here, hidden beneath the layers of knowing You have spent a lifetime accumulating.
If the most powerful man in Japan could find enlightenment in the simple sound of a hand striking the floor, what might be waiting for you in the quiet spaces between your own thoughts? Perhaps the answer isn't something you need to find, but something you need to stop looking for, allowing the truth to reveal itself in its own time. Much like the way the morning mist eventually gives way to the sun. Is it possible that the very thing you are searching for is the one who is doing the searching, hidden in plain sight behind the masks you wear for the world? This world of masks and roles is often where we find ourselves most lost, clinging to the idea of destiny as if it were a script written by someone else. We look for signs in the stars or the toss of a coin to tell us if we are permitted to succeed, forgetting that the hand that tosses the coin is the same hand that shapes the outcome. This brings us to a time in feudal Japan, when mountain mists concealed castle walls and the sound of steel rang through bamboo groves. A legendary warrior named Nobunaga faced his greatest military challenge, one that seemed to be his final chapter. The morning sun cast long, jagged shadows across his encampment, where a small, weary army prepared for what everyone believed was an impossible battle. Enemy forces outnumbered his men 10-1. Their banners stretched across the distant valley like a dark, suffocating sea of certain defeat. Nobunaga himself felt a quiet, inner confidence in his strategy, his years of experience having taught him to read the subtle signs that determine victory. The morale of the troops, the positioning of forces, the quality of leadership, and the crucial element of surprise. He knew with a deep, silent certainty that his forces could prevail despite the overwhelming odds. But he also knew that knowledge and confidence are not easily transferred from one mind to another. His soldiers, brave as they were, looked across at the massive enemy army with eyes clouded by growing doubt and fear. Whispered conversations circulated through the ranks about the impossibility of their situation. Some spoke of an honorable death, others of a tactical retreat, but few believed they could actually win the coming engagement. Their faces showed the strain of men preparing to fight against a fate that had already been decided. Understanding that victory depends as much on the hearts of warriors as on the skills of strategy, Nobunaga devised a plan to transform his soldiers' despair into determined, unwavering confidence. On the way to the battlefield, he stopped his army at a small Shinto shrine, nestled among ancient cedar trees. The sacred space emanated a profound tranquility, its wooden structures weathered smooth by centuries of prayers and offerings. Gathering his men around him, Nobunaga addressed them with a solemn authority that commanded absolute silence. He announced that after he visited the shrine and offered prayers for their success, he would toss a coin. If heads appeared, they would win the battle decisively. If tails showed, they would lose. He told them that destiny held them in her powerful hand, and they must accept whatever fate revealed. The soldiers watched with bated breath as their commander entered the shrine alone. Through the wooden slats, they could see him bowing deeply before the altar, his lips moving in what appeared to be a fervent, desperate prayer to the gods for guidance and protection. When Nobunaga emerged from the shrine, every eye was fixed upon him, searching for a sign. He reached into his sleeve and withdrew a single coin, holding it high so the morning light caught the metal. He tossed it, spinning into the air. Time seemed to suspend as the coin turned over and over, a silver blur against the sky, finally landing with a clear, metallic ring on the stone path. Heads. A tremendous, earth-shaking cheer erupted from the assembled warriors. Their doubt transformed instantly into a jubilant, electric confidence. If destiny itself had decreed their victory, how could they possibly fail? The gods had spoken through the sacred coin, and their fate was sealed. When the battle commenced, Nobunaga's forces fought with such fierce determination and unwavering belief in their destined victory that they overwhelmed the larger enemy army completely. Their conviction became a weapon more powerful than any sword, creating the very victory that the coin had supposedly predicted. Later, as they celebrated around the evening campfires, Nobunaga's personal attendant approached him with deep admiration, remarking that no one can change the hand of destiny. The gods had shown them their fate, and it came to pass exactly as foretold. Nobunaga smiled quietly and reached into his sleeve, showing his attendant a coin that had been specially crafted with heads facing on both sides. There had never been any possibility of tails appearing. This teaching reveals a profound truth that the Buddha emphasized. We are what we think, and with our thoughts, we make the world. External circumstances often matter far less than the internal state of consciousness we bring to them.
We so readily surrender our power to external forces, whether we call them destiny, fate, luck, or circumstances beyond our control, because we misunderstand the relationship between acceptance and action. Nobunaga accepted the reality of his situation while simultaneously taking creative action to transform it. He understood that the facts of a situation are always embedded within a context of meaning, and we have far more influence over that context than we typically realize. This principle of internal power and responsibility extends into every facet of our lives, even into our understanding of morality and harm. As we continue our journey, we find ourselves in the golden light of a late afternoon in a mountain temple, where Master Gasan sat teaching his disciples. The ancient wooden beams creaked softly in the breeze, and incense drifted through the air like prayers made visible. His disciples expected a lecture on meditation techniques or the intricacies of Buddhist philosophy. Instead, Gasan began speaking about something that seemed to contradict the fundamental principles they had been studying. The first precept of Buddhism is the protection of all sentient life from harm, a teaching that guides practitioners toward reverence for all living beings, even the smallest insects. Gasan acknowledged that those who desire to spare the lives of all conscious beings are right, and that we should treat all life with reverence. The students nodded, comfortable in this familiar territory of compassion. But then, the master's teaching took an unexpected turn that challenged their conventional understanding of what it truly means to kill. He asked them about those who kill time. He asked about those who destroy wealth through wasteful consumption and meaningless luxury, or those who destroy the political economy through corruption and greed. The disciples felt their comfortable certainties begin to shift. They had never considered that wasting time might be a form of killing, or that squandering resources could be a form of violence. But Gasan's most piercing statement was yet to come. He told them that the one who preaches without enlightenment is killing Buddhism itself. This final statement struck the students like thunder. Here was their revered teacher suggesting that sharing spiritual principles without genuine realization was perhaps the most serious form of harm, the destruction of the very wisdom that could liberate countless beings from suffering. They began to see how their narrow understanding of killing had blinded them to subtler, more damaging forms of destruction. Time is the fundamental currency of life, the raw material from which we create meaning and awakening. When we kill time through mindless distraction or a purposeless activity, we are destroying irreplaceable opportunities for growth. Think of the hours lost to mindless scrolling, obsessive worry, or empty entertainment.
These represent a form of violence against your own potential and against a world that could benefit from your presence. The Buddha warned that the trouble is we think we have time, leading us to treat moments carelessly as if they were renewable resources rather than unique, unrepeatable gifts. Similarly, the wasteful consumption of resources for temporary pleasure represents a form of violence against those who are deprived. Our individual choices create collective patterns that determine how the earth's abundance is distributed.
When we act from pure self-interest, we participate in killing the social fabric that supports everyone's well-being. Most challenging of all is the responsibility that comes with sharing wisdom. When we repeat teachings we haven't integrated or use spiritual concepts to enhance our ego, we risk distorting the truth. To study the Buddha way is to study the self, and to study the self is to forget the self. Without this forgetting, even well-intentioned sharing can become a form of spiritual materialism. True protection of life requires not just avoiding physical violence, but actively cultivating life-giving choices in every dimension of our existence. It asks us to examine where we might be surrendering our power to external circumstances, or where we might be causing subtle harm through our lack of awareness. This requirement for authentic presence and integrity leads us to the story of Master Kasan, a man who had spent many years cultivating his understanding in a remote mountain monastery. Kasan had a reputation for wisdom and composure, living a life marked by the peaceful rhythms of meditation and instruction. He felt confident in his realization, protected by the familiar environment of his mountain retreat and the reverence of his students. However, an unexpected request arrived that would test the depth of his development in a way he had never anticipated. He was asked to officiate at the funeral ceremony of a provincial lord, a man of great political importance. This was an honor, but it meant stepping out of the monastery and into a world of social protocol, aristocratic customs, and public scrutiny. Kasan had never navigated the world of lords and nobles. His life had been spent among monks and simple villagers. The thought of conducting a ceremony before such a sophisticated audience filled him with an unexpected, gnawing anxiety. When the day of the funeral arrived, Kasan found himself in a grand temple in the provincial capital, an ornate space far removed from his simple wooden home. Hundreds of elegantly dressed mourners filled the hall, their silk robes rustling with formal precision. As the ceremony began, Kasan was overwhelmed by the weight of so many sophisticated eyes upon him. Despite his years of practice, he began to sweat profusely. This was not from physical heat, but from the mental tension of trying to maintain a composed mask while feeling completely out of his element. His nervousness was visible to everyone, a direct contradiction to the serene confidence expected of a Zen master. He managed to complete the ceremony, but the experience left him deeply shaken. The contrast between his usual composure and this obvious anxiety revealed the limitation he could no longer ignore. Upon returning to his temple, Kasan did something extraordinary. He did not make excuses or pretend the ceremony had gone well. He called his students together and confessed with radical honesty that he was not yet qualified to be their teacher. He realized that his practice was incomplete because it had only been developed within comfortable, familiar circumstances. He lacked what he called a sameness of bearing, the ability to remain undisturbed whether in a mountain hut or a royal palace. Demonstrating a level of integrity that is rare in any age, he resigned his position and became a student once again. For 8 long years, he studied with a new master, specifically working on developing a presence that remained stable regardless of external pressures. He practiced in urban environments and politically charged situations, intentionally seeking out the very contexts that had once caused him to tremble. When he finally returned to his monastery, he was a transformed man, possessing an authority that came not from his title or his knowledge, but from a realization that had been tempered in the crucible of the real world. He'd learned that true spiritual maturity is not found in the absence of challenge, but in the consistency of one's heart when the world is at its most demanding. This journey from the mountain to the city and back again raises a question for all of us. How much of our own peace is dependent on things staying exactly as they are? Buddhist psychology identifies several ego patterns that create this resistance to our own growth. First is our attachment to identity and reputation.
Once we are seen as knowledgeable or competent in any area, admitting limitations feels like a threat to our carefully constructed self-image. We mistake the mask for the face, and when the mask begins to crack under the pressure of an unfamiliar social environment, we panic. Second is our confusion of humility with humiliation. We fear that acknowledging our limitations will diminish us in others' eyes, when in fact, such honesty often increases genuine respect and trust. Kazan's students were not disappointed by his confession. They were inspired by his integrity. They saw a man who valued the truth of his own soul more than the status of his position. Third is our tendency to compartmentalize our development, assuming that wisdom gained in one context automatically transfers to all others. Kazan had developed genuine understanding within the protected environment of monastic life, but discovered that this understanding had not yet been tested in the crucible of worldly complexity. Zen master Suzuki Roshi famously taught that in the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind there are few. Kazan's willingness to return to a beginner's mind after years of teaching demonstrated the kind of spiritual maturity that values growth over image and truth over comfort. His sweat revealed something more than simple nervousness. It showed the profound difference between theoretical understanding and embodied realization. He could explain Buddhist teachings eloquently and guide meditation skillfully within the mountain walls, but his understanding had not yet become stable enough to remain undisturbed by social pressure and unfamiliar expectations. True spiritual authority comes not from never being challenged or uncomfortable, but from maintaining an inner stability that remains unshakable regardless of external circumstances. This stability is not achieved through avoiding difficulties, but through repeatedly testing our understanding in increasingly challenging contexts until it becomes as natural as breathing. As you reflect on your own areas of knowledge and competence tonight, can you identify situations that might reveal limitations you have not yet recognized? What would it look like to approach such discoveries with Kazan's honesty, rather than defensive rationalization? As the Buddha taught, three things cannot be long hidden: the sun, the moon, and the truth. Kazan's sweat revealed the truth about his incomplete development, and his response to that revelation became the foundation for his eventual mastery. Sometimes, our greatest failures become the very doorways to our deepest wisdom.
This journey toward a deeper truth leads us to the power of a transcendent perspective, a teaching that comes directly from the Enlightened One himself. This is the Buddha's own description of ultimate reality, shared during a quiet moment that would forever change how his disciples viewed the world. In the shade of the great Bodhi tree, where the Buddha had achieved his awakening, disciples gathered during the peaceful hours of late afternoon. The leaves rustled gently overhead, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced across the ground like living mandalas. The air was warm and still, filled with a profound tranquility that seemed to emanate from the Buddha's very presence.
On this particular day, rather than offering a parable or responding to questions, the Buddha chose to share his direct perception of reality as seen from the vantage point of complete enlightenment. His words would reveal how radically different the awakened consciousness views the world compared to ordinary perception.
Speaking with the gentle authority that came from perfect understanding, the Buddha began to describe his vision. I consider the positions of kings and rulers as that of dust motes. I observe treasures of gold and gems as so many bricks and pebbles. The disciples listened with growing amazement as their teacher continued to dissolve the conventional hierarchies and values that governed ordinary human life. I look upon the finest silken robes as tattered rags. I see myriad worlds of the universe as small seeds of fruit, and the greatest lake in India as a drop of oil on my foot.
With each comparison, the Buddha was revealing how enlightened consciousness perceives the relative nature of all phenomena. Things that seem overwhelmingly important from an ordinary perspective appear insignificant when viewed from the standpoint of ultimate understanding. I perceive the teachings of the world to be the illusion of magicians, he continued, his voice carrying infinite compassion for the confusion that these illusions create in unawakened minds. I discern the highest conception of emancipation as a golden brocade in a dream, and view the holy path of the illuminated ones as flowers appearing in one's eyes. Now the Buddha was addressing even the most sacred concepts and practices, revealing that, from the perspective of complete realization, even the spiritual path itself is ultimately empty of the solid reality we attribute to it.
I see meditation as a pillar of a mountain, and nirvana as a nightmare of daytime, he said, dismantling any attachment his disciples might have to meditation practice or even to the goal of enlightenment itself. Finally, the Buddha concluded with observations about the conceptual frameworks through which humans typically organize their understanding. I look upon the judgment of right and wrong as the serpentine dance of a dragon, and the rise and fall of beliefs as but traces left by the four seasons. With these words, the Enlightened One revealed that even moral judgments and philosophical systems, however necessary they might be for ordinary human functioning, are ultimately as impermanent and insubstantial as dragon dances or seasonal changes. The disciples sat in stunned silence, their conventional understanding of reality thoroughly challenged by this glimpse into awakened perception.
Everything they had considered solid, important, and real had been revealed as temporary, relative, and ultimately empty of inherent significance. The Buddha taught that form is emptiness, and emptiness is form. This fundamental teaching underlies every comparison he made. The recognition that all phenomena are empty of permanent, independent existence, while simultaneously manifesting as the play of consciousness itself. Why is it so difficult for unawakened minds to grasp this perspective? Buddhist psychology explains that our ordinary consciousness is constructed through layers of conceptual filters that create the appearance of solid, separate, and permanent phenomena. We become so identified with these mental constructions that we mistake them for ultimate reality itself. First is our tendency toward reification, treating abstract concepts, social constructions, and temporary appearances as if they possessed a solid, unchanging essence. We see the king and the beggar as fundamentally different categories, rather than as temporary roles, being played by the same underlying Buddha nature. Second is our attachment to relative comparisons as absolute truths. We believe that gold is inherently more valuable than pebbles, or that spiritual achievement makes someone inherently better than others. The Buddha's vision reveals these as conventional agreements rather than ultimate realities. Third is our identification with the content of consciousness, rather than with consciousness itself. We become so absorbed in the constantly changing parade of thoughts, emotions, and perceptions that we lose contact with the unchanging awareness within which all these phenomena arise and pass away. Zen Master Nagarjuna taught that all phenomena are neither existent nor non-existent, but are like a magical display, a mirage, clouds in the sky, or a dream. This points to the middle way between believing things are absolutely real and believing they do not exist at all. It is the recognition of them as appearances within consciousness that have conventional but not ultimate reality. Consider how your own perspective might shift if you could see through the Buddha's eyes, even briefly. The urgent email that feels so important, the social status you are trying to maintain, the political beliefs you defend so passionately. How might these appear from the vantage point of enlightened awareness? This does not mean becoming indifferent to life, but rather acting from compassion rather than attachment. The Buddha said that in the sky there is no distinction of east and west. People create distinctions out of their own minds and then believe them to be true. Our world is full of such mentally created distinctions that we treat as absolute reality. Success and failure, sacred and ordinary. This teaching also illuminates the paradox of spiritual practice itself. We use meditation to go beyond meditation and follow a path that ultimately reveals there is nowhere to go and nothing to achieve. As the Buddha observed, even the highest spiritual attainments are like flowers appearing in our eyes, meaningful within the dream of seeking, but empty when viewed from awakened understanding. Yet this emptiness is not a void, but the fullness of pure potential. When we recognize the dreamlike nature of all phenomena, we become free to engage with life playfully and compassionately, rather than with desperate grasping. Tonight, as you observe the thoughts arising in your mind, can you experiment with viewing them as temporary weather patterns rather than ultimate reality? To understand this shift in value, we must turn to a tale that reveals the paradox of true worth beyond conventional measurement. This is the story of the head of a dead cat. In the mountains of ancient China, where morning mist wrapped around temple peaks like silk scarves and the sound of wooden bells echoed through pine forests, a young monk approached his teacher with a question that had been troubling him deeply. Master Sosan sat in quiet contemplation in his simple chamber, surrounded by the sparse furnishings that marked a life devoted entirely to spiritual understanding. The student had been observing the world beyond the monastery walls with growing confusion about human priorities. He watched merchants haggling over silk and jade with faces tightened by greed. He saw officials competing for positions and titles as if their lives depended on a name. He even noticed fellow monastics displaying attachment to precious texts or ceremonial objects, as if the physical paper held the wisdom itself. The entire human enterprise seemed organized around the pursuit and protection of things considered valuable. Yet, the student sensed something fundamentally misguided in these pursuits. Bowing respectfully before his master, the young monk posed his question with earnest sincerity. Master Sosan, what is the most valuable thing in the world? I see people devoting their entire lives to acquiring wealth, power, or even spiritual merit, but I cannot understand what truly deserves our highest regard. The student expected a teaching about the preciousness of human life or the infinite value of compassion. Instead, Master Sosan's response was so unexpected that it stopped the student's thinking mind completely.
The head of a dead cat, the master said. The young monk stared in bewilderment. Of all the possible answers, this seemed the most ridiculous. A dead cat's head appeared to be not just worthless, but actively repulsive. Master, the student said carefully, why is the head of a dead cat the most valuable thing in the world? How can something so apparently worthless be more precious than gold or enlightenment itself? Sosan looked at him with a faint smile and replied, because no one can name its price. With those few words,
the master revealed a truth about value that completely transcends economic thinking. We assign value to things based on scarcity and demand, yet the most essential things for our survival, the air we breathe, the sunlight that warms us, are often overlooked because they are freely available. We confuse price with value, assuming that expensive things must be more worthwhile. But Sosan's dead cat head represents perfect worthlessness from a conventional perspective, combined with perfect pricelessness from an ultimate perspective. Because no one wants to buy it, it cannot be corrupted by the market or reduced to a number. In its complete uselessness to the ego, it becomes a symbol of value that exists beyond valuation. Consider the things in your own life that are truly priceless. The trust of a friend, the sensation of breathing freely, the simple fact of being conscious. These cannot be purchased at any price, yet they are the actual substance of a meaningful life. Zen master Ikkyu once observed that a stone Buddha deserves all the bird droppings it gets, a reminder that sacredness cannot be captured in objects, no matter how expensive they might be. The Buddha taught that those who envy others do not obtain peace of mind because they are preoccupied with comparative value rather than the immeasurable wealth they already possess. Modern culture depends on us forgetting this teaching. It works by convincing us that happiness and identity can be purchased, leading to an endless cycle of acquisition and disappointment. The dead cat's head also represents the reality of impermanence. From the perspective of ultimate truth, all our cherished possessions are as temporary as that decomposing head. Our attachment to them, as if they were permanent, creates suffering when they inevitably change. Yet this recognition does not lead to despair, but to a deeper appreciation of the present. The sunset is more beautiful when we don't try to own it. Life is more precious when we don't pretend it will last forever. In Zen, there is a beauty found in the imperfect and the incomplete, an aesthetic that sees worth in the simple acceptance of what is. Sosan's answer forced the student to look past the labels of valuable and worthless to see the intrinsic reality of the object itself. Tonight, as you take inventory of your own aspirations, can you identify what in your life exists beyond the realm of calculation? Perhaps you will discover that you have been carrying immeasurable treasure all along, simply because you never tried to put a price on it. As the student sat there, the silence of the mountain seemed to confirm the master's strange wisdom, leaving him to wonder how many other priceless things he had stepped over in his search for gold. The mountain air grew thin and cold as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, casting long purple shadows across the temple grounds where 4 young monks of the Tendai school sat in solemn preparation. They had reached a turning point in their spiritual journey, a moment where words felt too small to contain the vastness of the truth they were seeking. Together, they made a pact that was as simple as it was daunting. They would observe 7 days of absolute, unbroken silence. This was not merely a test of their willpower, but an invitation to listen to the quiet language of the soul that is usually drowned out by the noise of daily life. They imagined that by closing their lips, they would automatically open the doors to enlightenment, unaware that the loudest noise often comes from within, echoing in the chambers of a mind that is not yet at peace. Long before Zen had fully established its roots in the soil of Japan, these sincere practitioners followed the traditional methods of their lineage, seeking the Dharma through disciplined study and contemplative exercises. They had developed a bond of close friendship, a brotherhood forged in the shared heat of spiritual ambition. They spent their days immersed in sacred texts and their evenings in philosophical discussions about the nature of reality. Yet they sensed that something was still missing, a depth of quietude that could only be found by stepping away from the comfort of speech. One autumn morning, as golden leaves swirled like tiny dervishes in the monastery courtyard, they committed themselves to the silence. For 7 days and 7 nights, they would communicate only through necessary gestures, maintaining their meditation schedule and observing the movements of their own awareness. The first day proceeded with a beauty that surprised them all. They moved through their routines with a serene mindfulness, the absence of conversation creating a deeper quality of attention. They noticed the subtle creak of the floorboards, the distant call of a mountain bird, and the gentle rhythm of their own breathing in a way they never had before. Without the need to explain or entertain, their minds seemed to settle like silt in a glass of water, leaving a clarity that felt auspicious. They were confident, perhaps too confident, in their ability to maintain this sanctuary of stillness. But as evening approached and the oil lamps were lit, the flickering flames began to cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to mirror the restlessness beginning to stir beneath the surface of their resolve. As the night deepened, the oil in the lamps began to burn low. The dancing flames grew dimmer and dimmer, threatening to leave the meditation hall in a heavy, suffocating darkness. One of the students, unable to tolerate the practical problem of inadequate lighting, found his focus shifting from his breath to the dying wicks. He noticed a temple servant moving nearby in the shadows. Before he could catch himself, before the mindfulness of the day could intervene, his voice cut through the stillness like a sharp blade through silk. "Fix those lamps," he called out, the sound echoing harshly against the wooden beams. The moment the words escaped, he felt a cold wave of dismay. He had broken the vow, his desire for external order overriding his commitment to internal quiet. The second student was struck by a wave of astonishment. He had believed in their collective strength, and to hear the silence shattered so casually felt like a betrayal of their sacred pact. His surprise and disappointment quickly overcame his own resolve to remain silent. He turned to the first student with a look of stern reproach, his voice heavy with the very noise he was trying to forbid. "We are not supposed to say a word," he remarked, his tone carrying a mixture of disbelief and self-righteousness. In his haste to remind his friend of their vow, he had violated that same vow himself, his silence dissolving into the shadows of the dimly lit hall. He had focused so intently on the failure of another that he became blind to the sound of his own voice. The third student watched this exchange with a growing sense of incredulity. He saw the hypocrisy unfolding before him and felt a surge of judgment that tasted sweeter than any meditation. How could his two friends be so obviously weak, breaking their silence merely to discuss their silence? His sense of superiority overcame his commitment to the practice. "You two are stupid," he muttered, his voice filled with a sharp, critical sting. "Why did you talk?" Even as the words emerged, he recognized the absurdity of his position. In criticizing others for speaking, he had spoken himself, falling into the exact same trap he was condemning. He was now a participant in the very noise he felt so superior to. Yet his ego was so clouded by judgment that he felt justified in his failure. The fourth student had observed this entire sequence with a mixture of amusement and pride. He watched each of his friends succumb to the same pattern, watching them break their vows while attempting to address or criticize the failures of others. He felt a swelling of satisfaction in his chest, a sense of discipline that seemed to set him apart from his struggling brothers. He was the only one who had remained firm, the only one who truly possessed the self-control required for such a task. Unable to contain his sense of triumph, he made his own fatal mistake. "I am the only one who has not talked," he announced with obvious pride. With those words, the fourth student completed the comedy of errors. In the act of congratulating himself for his silence, he had destroyed the very accomplishment he was celebrating. The irony was perfect and complete. Each student had broken their vow while focusing on the failure of someone else to maintain theirs. This experience illuminates a deeper issue that remains as relevant today as it was in that ancient monastery. True silence is not merely the absence of speech, but the presence of an inner tranquility that remains undisturbed by external circumstances. The students were trying to create silence by controlling their outward expression, while ignoring the internal commentary that was generating their reactive responses. They were monitoring each other's behavior while remaining unconscious of their own mental patterns, a habit that prevents the self-awareness necessary for any genuine spiritual discipline. Why do we find it so difficult to maintain the commitments we make to ourselves? It is often because we are trapped in reactive behavior, automatically responding to situations without the pause of mindful awareness that would allow us to remember our deeper intentions. The first student reacted to the practical problem of the lamps without considering how his response would affect his vow. The others reacted to his mistake with judgment and pride. They all fell into the trap of spiritual competition, where ego gratification becomes more important than the actual practice. Zen Master Hangpo taught that our everyday mind is the way, but when we try to turn toward it with forceful effort, we only move further away from the natural quietude that is already ours.
Real silence emerges naturally when we stop struggling with the contents of consciousness and instead rest in the awareness that observes all mental activity without being disturbed by it. We cannot achieve inner quiet through the forceful suppression of thoughts or the aggressive monitoring of our state. The students transformed their retreat into an opportunity for self-congratulation or criticism, missing the point of the practice entirely. True discipline requires a right effort, an attention that is neither too tight nor too loose, like a stringed instrument that must be tuned perfectly to produce a clear note. When we notice the constant stream of internal commentary in our own lives, we can experiment with a silence that does not require the suppression of thought, but the recognition of the space in which all thoughts arise and pass away. This journey toward authenticity often leads us to confront the power of uncompromising honesty over the comfort of flattering deception. In the rolling hills of feudal Japan, where ancient castles overlooked terraced rice fields and cherry trees lined the roads like rows of praying monks, a wealthy provincial lord found himself drawn to the teachings of Zen. His castle was a place of immense beauty, adorned with painted screens and surrounded by meticulously maintained gardens that whispered of order and prosperity. He was a man of great intellect and influence, a patron of scholars and a master of his domain. Yet, he felt a persistent emptiness that no amount of material luxury or intellectual pursuit could fill. He had heard of Zen's promise to reveal the true nature of the mind directly, and he decided to invite two prominent teachers to his estate to seek their guidance. The masters, Gudo and Daigu, were known throughout the region for their wisdom, though their styles were as different as the sun and the moon. The Lord looked forward to their visit, expecting that their presence would bring great honor to his household while advancing his own spiritual development. He prepared for their arrival with elaborate ceremony, ensuring that every detail of the reception hall reflected the respect due to such esteemed guests. Silk cushions were arranged with mathematical precision, and rare incense filled the air with a delicate, lingering fragrance that seemed to sanctify the space. The Lord presented himself with the dignity of his station, yet he attempted to wear a cloak of humility, hoping to make a favorable impression that would mark him as a worthy and gifted student of the way. As the ceremony commenced, Master Gudo was the first to speak.
He was a man of courtesy and encouragement, and after observing the Lord's obvious sincerity and intelligence, he offered a recognition that was as pleasant as a warm breeze. "Your Lordship," Gudo said, his voice smooth and reassuring. "It is clear that you are wise by nature and possess an inborn ability to learn Zen. Your quick understanding and natural depth suggest that you will make excellent progress in our practice." The Lord felt a deep sense of gratification. This assessment confirmed his own secret belief that he was special, that his intellectual gifts would allow him to bypass the long, arduous struggles that others faced on the path to enlightenment. Gudo's words were like a mirror that reflected back only the Lord's most flattering image. However, Master Daigu had been sitting in silence, his eyes like two dark pools that seemed to see through the Lord's silk robes and into the very marrow of his bones. When he spoke, his voice was not a warm breeze, but a sudden freezing wind. "Nonsense," he said bluntly, the word cutting through the polite atmosphere like a blade. "Why do you flatter this blockhead? He may hold the title of Lord, but he doesn't know anything genuine about Zen or authentic spiritual understanding." The hall fell into a stunned, breathless silence. The servants stood as still as statues, their eyes wide with terror, waiting for the Lord's inevitable explosion of rage. No one had ever dared to address him with such naked disrespect, let alone in his own reception hall, surrounded by the symbols of his power. The Lord's face flushed a deep, burning crimson. His hand moved instinctively toward the hilt of his sword, his pride wounded and his authority challenged in the most public way imaginable. But as he looked at Daigu, he saw something that stopped his anger in its tracks. He saw a man who was completely indifferent to his power, his wealth, and his titles. Daigu was not trying to win his favor or secure his patronage. He was offering something far more valuable than praise. He was offering the truth. In that moment of profound shock, the Lord realized that Gudo's flattery, while pleasant, was a dead end. It would only reinforce the very ego that he was trying to transcend. Daigu's insult, though painful, was a direct hit on the prison walls of his self-importance. He realized that if he wanted to find the truth, he would have to follow the man who was brave enough to call him a blockhead. This choice between the comfortable lie and the difficult truth is one that we all face in our own lives. We naturally gravitate toward those who confirm our flattering narratives, avoiding the voices that challenge our assumptions or point out our limitations. We confuse kindness with enabling and mistake honesty for cruelty, never realizing that the most compassionate thing someone can do is to hold up a mirror that shows us exactly where we are stuck. Daigu's apparent harshness was a form of deep love, the willingness to risk the Lord's displeasure for the sake of his awakening. He knew that Zen is not about adding more decorations to the ego, but about the radical dismantling of everything we think we know about ourselves. The Lord, in his wisdom, recognized that he needed a teacher who would refuse to coddle him, who would see past the silk and the titles to the blockhead who was truly searching for peace. Under Daigu's demanding guidance, the Lord began the long process of unlearning. He discovered that real practice involves the continual surrender of pride and the recognition of one's own ignorance. He saw that flattery is a form of spiritual poison that keeps us asleep, while direct criticism, when offered without judgment, can be the catalyst for a total transformation of the heart. As he sat in the quiet of his new temple, listening to the wind move through the ancient pines, he realized that he had finally found the abundance he had been searching for. It was not found in the praise of others or the accumulation of knowledge, but in the simple, honest presence of a mind that no longer needed to be special. He looked back on the day of the ceremony, remembering the scent of the incense and the shock of Daigu's words. and he understood that the most important moment of his life was the moment his pride was shattered. It was in that brokenness that the light of the Dharma had finally been able to enter, illuminating a path that was far more beautiful than any castle he had ever built. This realization, though jarring, is the true beginning of the spiritual path. Why do we so readily prefer comfortable lies over challenging truths? Buddhist psychology identifies several ego patterns that create this preference. First is our deep-seated attachment to self-image and the stories we tell ourselves about our abilities, intelligence, and spiritual advancement. We naturally gravitate toward people and teachings that confirm these flattering narratives, avoiding those that question them. Master Gudo's approach appealed to the Lord's desire to see himself as naturally gifted and destined for easy spiritual success. This kind of encouragement feels good initially, but often acts as a sedative, preventing the deep questioning and ego dissolution necessary for authentic awakening. Second is our tendency to confuse kindness with enabling and mistake honesty for cruelty. We often interpret direct feedback as a personal attack, rather than recognizing it as the gift of clear perception offered without an ulterior motive. Daigu's apparent harshness was actually the deepest form of compassion, the willingness to speak truth regardless of its reception, motivated by a genuine concern for the Lord's spiritual welfare rather than personal comfort or political advantage. Third is our inclination to choose teachers and advisors based on how they make us feel, rather than on their capacity to help us grow. We seek confirmation of our existing understanding rather than transformation of our limited perspective. Zen master Linji once taught his students the radical instruction, "If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him." This points to the necessity of destroying all fixed concepts and comfortable assumptions, including those about our own spiritual accomplishments. Daigu's willingness to speak the uncomfortable truth created the only conditions where authentic learning could occur, while Gudo's diplomatic approach, however well-intentioned, risked obscuring the Lord's actual spiritual condition. Real spiritual friendship involves the courage to see each other clearly and speak honestly about what we observe, offering the hard medicine of reality rather than the sweet poison of comfortable delusion. This theme of authentic influence leads us to another path of transformation, one that moves not through the sharp sword of words, but through the profound power of silent example. In the quiet mountains of Japan, where bamboo groves whispered ancient secrets and streams carried the songs of countless seasons to the sea, there lived the Zen monk Ryokan. He devoted his entire existence to the study and practice of the Buddha's way, living a life of profound simplicity. He owned nothing but his robes, a begging bowl, and the poems he composed during long walks through forest paths where dewdrops caught the morning light like suspended prayers. Ryokan had renounced all worldly concerns to pursue enlightenment, leaving behind the management of his family's hereditary estate to focus completely on spiritual development. Years passed in peaceful solitude, marked only by the changing seasons and the deepening of his understanding through meditation and contemplation. One day, disturbing news reached Ryokan at his remote mountain hermitage. His nephew, who had assumed responsibility for managing the family property in Ryokan's absence, was squandering the inheritance through reckless behavior. Despite repeated warnings and entreaties from concerned relatives, the young man was spending enormous sums on a courtesan, neglecting his duties and allowing the family's carefully accumulated wealth to dissipate rapidly. The situation had become critical. Generations of careful stewardship were being undone by one person's self-indulgent choices. The family property, which supported not only the nephew but also various dependents and community obligations, was in serious danger of being lost entirely. Feeling desperate, the relatives turned to Ryokan as their last hope, believing that the respected monk's moral authority and family connection might influence the nephew where all other interventions had failed. They pleaded with Ryokan to travel to the young man's residence and use his spiritual influence to reform this destructive behavior. The request placed Ryokan in a difficult position. His spiritual practice emphasized non-interference and the acceptance of what is. Yet his family loyalty and compassion suggested that some response was appropriate. After careful consideration, he agreed to make the journey. The trip required Ryokan to travel a considerable distance from his mountain retreat to the town where his nephew lived. He had not seen the young man for many years, and their reunion carried the weight of changed circumstances and unspoken expectations. When Ryokan arrived, the young man seemed genuinely pleased to see his uncle again, welcoming him warmly and inviting him to stay overnight, sensing nothing of the ulterior purpose behind this unexpected visit. Throughout the evening, relatives and neighbors waited with bated breath for Ryokan to address the pressing issue. They expected lectures about responsibility, warnings about the consequences of excess, or appeals to family honor. Surely a respected Zen teacher would use this opportunity to provide moral guidance. But Ryokan said nothing about the courtesan, the wasted money, or the concerns of the family. Instead, he spent the entire night in silent meditation, sitting motionless in the traditional posture, while his nephew slept nearby. The old monk's presence filled the room with a profound tranquility, demonstrating through his very bearing the peace that comes from a life devoted to spiritual cultivation. The silence was not empty. It was a heavy, resonant space that seemed to reflect the nephew's own restlessness back to him. When morning came and Ryokan prepared to depart, the relative's anticipation reached its peak. Surely now he would deliver the confrontational message they had requested. Instead, as Ryokan gathered his few possessions, he made a simple request that seemed completely unrelated to the serious purpose of his visit. "I must be getting old," he said with gentle humility. "My hands shake so much these days. When you help me tie the string of my straw sandal." The nephew responded immediately with natural kindness, kneeling to assist his elderly uncle. His movements were careful and respectful, showing genuine concern for his relative's physical limitations. As he tied the sandal, he felt the frailty of the old man's foot and the simplicity of his life. "Thank you," Ryokan said softly when the sandal was secured. "You see, a man becomes older and feebler day by day. Take good care of yourself." With these few words, the old monk departed, leaving everyone puzzled. He had offered no lectures, made no demands, and issued no warnings. Yet from that very morning, the nephew's dissolute behavior ended completely. The relationship with the courtesan was terminated, financial responsibility resumed, and the family estate was preserved. The transformation was immediate and lasting, though its mechanism remained mysterious to everyone, except perhaps the nephew himself. The Buddha once declared, "Your actions speak so loudly, I cannot hear what you are saying." This teaching illuminates the principle underlying Ryokan's approach, that authentic influence operates through the power of embodied wisdom rather than through verbal persuasion or moral argument. Why did Ryokan's gentle, indirect approach succeed where direct confrontation had failed? Buddhist understanding reveals that direct moral pressure often triggers defensive responses that strengthen rather than weaken destructive patterns. By refusing to judge or criticize, Ryokan allowed the nephew to see his own behavior clearly, without the defensive reactions that typically arise when we feel attacked. Furthermore, the nephew spent an entire night in the company of someone who embodied the peace and contentment he had been seeking through external pleasures. This direct exposure to genuine fulfillment revealed the futility of his substitute satisfactions. Ryokan's presence reminded his nephew of his own Buddha nature, the inherent wisdom and compassion that had been obscured by self-indulgence but never destroyed. The simple request for help with the sandal created a moment of genuine human connection that bypassed all the nephew's defensive mechanisms. In that moment of natural service, the young man experienced his own essential kindness, a quality that was incompatible with his continued self-centered indulgence. Ryokan's comment about aging and fragility also served to remind the nephew of life's impermanence and the precious nature of time. It demonstrated humility and vulnerability rather than moral superiority.
Tonight, as you consider relationships where you'd like to see positive changes, can you experiment with Ryokan's approach of embodying the qualities you hope to encourage rather than demanding them? What would it look like to trust that the same Buddha nature you are trying to awaken in others is also working in you? This movement toward the essence of our nature brings us to the teaching of Master Bankei and the mystery of the ungovernable temper. Bankei sat in the peaceful courtyard of his temple, where late afternoon sunlight filtered through pine branches, casting gentle shadows on the weathered stone paths. His reputation for direct, uncompromising wisdom had spread throughout Japan, drawing seekers from distant provinces who hoped to receive teachings that could penetrate to the heart of their spiritual difficulties. On this particular day, a student approached with evident distress written across his features. His posture carried the weight of someone wrestling with a persistent inner demon, and his eyes reflected the frustration of many failed attempts at self-improvement. Bowing deeply, he spoke with urgent sincerity about a problem that had plagued him for years. "Master Bankei," the student said, his voice tight with anxiety, "I have an ungovernable temper that causes me great suffering and harms my relationships with others. When anger arises, it consumes me completely, and I say and do things I later deeply regret. Despite my best efforts to control this tendency, it continues to overwhelm me. How can I cure this terrible affliction?" The student was prepared for a long lecture on the ethics of patience or a complex meditation technique to suppress his rage. He expected the master to treat his temper as a formidable enemy that needed to be defeated through iron will and spiritual discipline. Instead, Bankei's response was characteristically direct and entirely unexpected. "You have something very strange indeed," the master said. "Let me see what you have. Show it to me now." The student was understandably puzzled by this request. "Just now, I cannot show it to you," he replied hesitantly. Bankei pressed further with apparent curiosity. "Then, when can you show it to me? If this temper is truly yours, surely you can produce it for examination whenever you wish." The student explained that it arose unexpectedly, that he never knew when it would appear, and that when it did, it seemed to have a life of its own. Bankei concluded with gentle but absolute authority, "Then it must not be your own true nature. If it were genuinely yours, you could show it to me at any time, just as you can show me your hand or your face. When you were born, you did not have this temper. Your parents did not give it to you. It is not an inherent part of your being, but rather something you have learned to identify with so completely that you mistake it for yourself." This radical reframing points to the heart of the Buddhist understanding of identity. Why do we so readily identify with our emotional reactions and mental habits? We say, "I am an angry person," or "I am an anxious person," rather than recognizing that anger or anxiety are merely temporary mental formations arising in the vast space of awareness. We merge with our experiences so completely that we lose sight of the observer. The student had become so identified with his anger that he couldn't imagine himself without it, even though it caused him immense pain.
Bankei's logic revealed that between the stimulus and the response, there is a space, and in that space lies our freedom. If equality is not present at all times, it cannot be our essence.
It is merely a visitor, a passing storm in an otherwise empty sky. Consider your own persistent emotional patterns. Perhaps you identify as naturally impatient or prone to worry. How might your relationship to these patterns shift if you recognize them as temporary weather systems rather than as permanent features of your psychological landscape? This ordinary mind, as Zen teachers call it, is not the collection of thoughts and reactions we typically identify with, but the natural awareness that remains present and undisturbed, regardless of what arises within it. Bankei's approach was not to fix the problem, but to undermine the very assumption that there was a self to which the problem belonged. He invited the student to step back from the fire of his rage and realize that he was the hearth, not the flame. When we stop trying to manage our emotions as if they were our possessions, we discover a profound sense of relief.
We realize that the demon we have been fighting is only a shadow, and that the light of our true nature has never been truly extinguished, only momentarily obscured. But if these tempers and anxieties are not our true nature, we are left with a question that has echoed through meditation halls for centuries. Who is the one who observes the storm? And where does that silent witness reside when the clouds finally begin to clear? This inquiry into the nature of the observer leads us away from the internal storms and toward a remote temple tucked away in a valley where the only sounds are the wind through bamboo groves and the distant calling of mountain birds. Master Hogan lived here in a solitude so profound that his days followed the natural rhythms of the earth, unmarked by the distractions of urban life or the complexities of monastic politics.
In this quiet setting, his understanding had deepened through years of uninterrupted contemplation, moving far beyond the reach of books and theories. One crisp autumn day, when maple leaves drifted like scarlet prayers across the temple grounds, 4 traveling monks appeared at his gate. They had been journeying between monasteries, studying with different teachers, and engaging in the kind of philosophical discussions that young practitioners often mistake for genuine spiritual inquiry. Hogan welcomed them with the natural hospitality of the mountains, offering them shelter and the simple comfort of a shared fire to ward off the cooling air. As the monks gathered wood and kindled the flames, their conversation resumed the intense philosophical debate they had apparently been conducting throughout their travels. Their voices carried the earnest intensity of those convinced that intellectual understanding could resolve the deepest mysteries of existence. Hogan sat quietly nearby, overhearing them argue passionately about subjectivity and objectivity, a classic philosophical problem that has occupied Buddhist scholars for centuries. They debated whether external objects exist independently of consciousness, or whether everything we perceive is merely a projection of the mind. Their discussion grew increasingly abstract and theoretical, with each monk defending his position through citations of various texts and complex logical arguments. Observing their intellectual wrestling match with a sense of compassionate amusement, Hogan decided to join their conversation. He approached the fire where the 4 monks sat warming their hands and offered a simple question that would cut through their elaborate philosophical constructions. He gestured toward a large boulder near the temple entrance, its surface weathered by 1,000 storms. "There is a big stone over there," Hogan said softly. "Do you consider it to be inside or outside your mind?" The monks paused their debate, recognizing that their host was proposing a practical test of their theoretical understanding. This was exactly the kind of concrete application they felt they needed to resolve their abstract arguments. One of the monks,
confident in his grasp of Buddhist philosophy, responded immediately. "From the Buddhist viewpoint, everything is an objectification of mind," he stated. "All phenomena are mental constructions, projections of consciousness itself. Therefore, I would say that the stone is inside my mind."
His answer reflected a sophisticated understanding of certain Buddhist teachings about the interdependence of subject and object, the role of consciousness in constructing experience, and the ultimate emptiness of independently existing phenomena. He felt a surge of pride, pleased with this demonstration of his philosophical sophistication. But Hogan's response was devastating in its simplicity and directness. "Your head must feel very heavy," the master remarked, "if you are carrying around a stone like that in your mind." The directness of this observation cut through all the monk's elaborate theorizing, revealing the absurdity that results when we mistake intellectual concepts for lived reality. The other monks fell silent, suddenly aware that their heated philosophical debate had somehow missed the point entirely. The Buddha once declared that we should not believe in anything simply because we have heard it spoken of many times, or because it is written in religious books. He taught that only after observation and analysis, when we find that something agrees with reason and is conducive to the good of all, should we accept it and live up to it. Hogan's teaching illuminates the trap that the traveling monks had fallen into, substituting intellectual knowledge about reality for the direct experience of reality itself. Their debate about subjectivity and objectivity had become an elaborate mental construction that obscured, rather than revealed, the simple immediacy of their actual situation. They were so busy arguing about the nature of the stone that they had forgotten the stone itself. Why do we so readily get lost in conceptual understanding while missing the direct experience of our lives? Buddhist analysis identifies several mental habits that create this confusion. First is our tendency to prefer thinking about life to actually living it. The monks were so engaged in debating the nature of perception that they lost contact with the simple act of perceiving. Second is our attachment to philosophical positions and the identity we derive from holding sophisticated views. Each monk had invested considerable intellectual pride in his understanding, making it difficult to abandon these concepts even when they proved inadequate to actual experience. Third is our confusion of the map with the territory, mistaking conceptual descriptions of reality for reality itself. Hogan's response demonstrates the Zen emphasis on immediate, practical wisdom over abstract speculation. His comment about the heavy head wasn't meant to ridicule the monk's intelligence, but rather to point out the practical consequence of taking conceptual teachings too literally. When we turn a teaching into a rigid belief, we end up carrying a weight that doesn't belong to us. Consider how often your own thinking becomes trapped in similar conceptual constructions. Perhaps you debate whether events happen for a reason versus by pure chance, or whether free will exists, or whether consciousness is produced by the brain. These philosophical positions, however sophisticated, can become barriers to direct engagement with life as it actually unfolds. The stone in Hogan's story represents the simple facticity of existence, things as they are before we overlay them with interpretations, categories, and philosophical frameworks. From one perspective, the stone is outside the mind in that it has apparent solidity and occupies space. From another perspective, it's inside the mind in that our experience of it depends entirely on consciousness. But these perspectives are both just concepts arising within awareness. When we stop carrying around heavy conceptual stones in our minds, we become available to the lightness and immediacy of unconditioned awareness. Hogan's teaching method reveals that true wisdom often works by undermining our attachment to the very questions we think are most important. This realization that we must live in harmony with reality rather than our ideas about it brings us to the flourishing merchant quarters of Edo period Japan. Here, silk banners announced successful enterprises, and the sound of coins rang through bustling marketplaces. A wealthy businessman lived in this world of commerce, having achieved everything that society defined as success. His trading ventures spanned multiple provinces, his warehouses overflowed with valuable goods, and his family enjoyed the finest luxuries available to the merchant class. Yet, despite his material accomplishments, the rich man felt troubled by a deep-seated concern about the future. He had witnessed other prosperous families lose their fortunes through poor decisions, changing economic conditions, or simple misfortune. The impermanence that seemed to govern all worldly affairs filled him with anxiety about preserving his family's legacy. Having heard of the wisdom and insight possessed by Zen masters, the wealthy merchant decided to seek spiritual guidance for his temporal concerns. He approached Master Sengai, whose reputation for profound understanding had spread throughout the region. The merchant brought with him an expensive sheet of specially prepared paper and fine calligraphy materials, hoping for a blessing that would act as a spiritual insurance policy. "Master Sengai," he said with respectful deference, "I would be deeply honored if you would write something for the continued prosperity of my family. Words of wisdom or blessing that might be treasured from generation to generation and help ensure our good fortune continues." He expected to receive an elegant poem about abundance, a prayer for divine protection, or perhaps a reflection on the principles of successful business. Sengai accepted the request and the expensive paper without a word. Taking up his brush with careful deliberation, he composed his calligraphy with the same attention he might give to copying a sacred sutra. When he had finished, he presented the document to the eager merchant. The wealthy man unrolled the scroll expectantly, confident that he would find profound wisdom expressed in beautiful characters. Instead, he read 3 simple lines that seemed to mock his request. "Father dies, son dies, grandson dies." The merchant's face flushed with anger and disbelief. He had approached this renowned teacher with sincere respect, only to receive what appeared to be a cruel and macabre joke about death and loss. "Master," he said with barely controlled indignation, "I asked you to write something for the happiness and prosperity of my family. Why do you make such a mockery of my sincere request?" Sengai's response was delivered with gentle patience, as if explaining something obvious to a confused child. "No joke is intended whatsoever," he said calmly. "What I have written represents the deepest possible blessing for your family's true prosperity." The master continued his explanation with compassionate directness, pointing out that if the merchant's son were to die before him, it would cause the most profound grief imaginable. If the grandson were to die before the son, both would be utterly broken-hearted. The natural order would be disrupted, and the family would suffer the greatest possible tragedy. But if your family, generation after generation, passes away in the order I have written, father dying before son, son before grandson, this follows the natural course of life itself, Sengai explained. Each person lives a full span of years, experiences the joys and challenges appropriate to their time, and departs when their season is complete. I call this real prosperity. The wealthy man sat in stunned silence as the profound truth of Sengai's teaching penetrated his consciousness. He had been seeking magical protection against the fundamental laws of existence, hoping that spiritual intervention could somehow exempt his family from the universal conditions that govern all life. He realized that true prosperity was not the absence of death, but the presence of the natural order.
The Buddha once taught that of all footprints, that of the elephant is supreme, and of all meditative themes, that of death is supreme. This teaching points to the transformative power of acknowledging mortality rather than denying it, recognizing that our deepest peace comes not from avoiding death, but from understanding its place in the natural flow of things. Why do we struggle so intensely against accepting the fundamental impermanence of all conditions? We often suffer from a deep-seated denial of mortality, clinging to the illusion that wealth or status can create a protective bubble around us.
This magical thinking prevents us from finding peace within the actual conditions of existence. We confuse security with the accumulation of external things, when true security comes from learning to find peace within impermanence itself. Sengai revealed prosperity as the natural unfolding of each life according to its proper timing. This teaching points to a profound shift in perspective, accepting our place within the flow of time rather than fighting against it. When we stop trying to control or stop time, we become available to the richness available within each moment. True prosperity comes not from hoarding resources or desperately attempting to preserve a status quo, but from participating in the natural flow of giving and receiving. Each generation's task is to live fully, contribute meaningfully, and then pass gracefully, making space for the next. This natural succession is the ultimate form of wealth, a continuity of life through appropriate change. Real prosperity includes the ability to appreciate deeply while things are present, and to accept gracefully when it is time to let go. This emotional and spiritual maturity provides a far greater security than any amount of material wealth or institutional protection. It invites us to ask whether we are seeking to exempt ourselves from the human condition, or whether we are willing to embrace the full spectrum of life, including its inevitable conclusion. As the merchant rolled up his scroll, his anxiety about the future began to dissolve, replaced by a quiet reverence for the natural order he had previously feared. He understood now that the most profound blessings are often hidden within the very truths we spend our lives trying to outrun, waiting for the moment we finally stop to listen. This brings us to our final destination, a place where all questions dissolve into the simple, rhythmic breath of the present. Let us conclude our journey with a story that teaches us about the profound simplicity that emerges when we finally stop clinging to complex concerns and hypothetical futures. This is the teaching of just going to sleep. In the quiet, shadowed chambers of an ancient temple, where paper screens filtered the soft silver glow of the moonlight and the fading scent of incense lingered in the still air, Master Taisui lay dying. His body, worn thin by decades of rigorous practice and selfless teaching, was finally approaching the natural conclusion of its earthly journey. Despite his physical weakness, his mind remained as clear as a mountain spring, and his spirit was undisturbed by the approaching transition. He was a man who had lived his truth, and now he was preparing to leave it behind, with the same grace with which he had carried it. For 3 days, his chosen successor, Gassan, had maintained a constant vigil at his teacher's bedside. Gassan provided comfort, attending to the practical matters of the sick room with the deep devotion that had marked their long relationship. The two men had worked together for many years, and Gassan's profound understanding and administrative capabilities had made him the obvious choice to carry on Taisui's teaching lineage. Yet, during this period of transition, Gassan found himself pulled in 1,000 directions at once. A fire had recently destroyed one of the temple's main buildings, and he was actively coordinating the reconstruction efforts while simultaneously preparing for his new role as the community's spiritual leader. The convergence of his teacher's approaching death with these immense practical demands created a complex web of concerns in Gassan's mind. As they sat together in the peaceful intimacy of the room, Taisui's curiosity about the future prompted him to ask a gentle question. "Gasan," he said, his voice a mere whisper, but filled with the directness that had always characterized him. "What are you going to do when you get the temple rebuilt?" Gasan's response reflected both his deep respect and his practical hopes for the community's future. "When your sickness is over, Master, we want you to speak there. We want you to give the inaugural teaching in our new building and bless it with your presence." It was a kind hope, a wish for continuity, but both men understood the unlikelihood that Taisui would ever recover sufficiently to fulfill such a role. The teacher's question probed deeper into the uncertainty Gasan was trying to manage. "Suppose I do not live until then," Taisui asked. "What will you do if I am no longer available for such ceremonies?" Without hesitation, Gasan replied with a matter-of-fact acceptance that he had learned from his years of training. "Then we will get someone else to give the inaugural teaching. The community will continue its work regardless of changing circumstances." He felt confident in this answer, believing it showed he was ready for the responsibility. But Taisui wasn't finished. He pressed further, pushing Gasan into the realm of the purely hypothetical. "Suppose you cannot find anyone suitable. What if no qualified teacher is available to perform this function? What then?" At this point, Gasan's patience with theoretical planning reached its limit. He saw the absurdity of the cycle they were entering, the endless what-ifs that draw the mind away from the reality of the moment. His voice rose with a sudden, compassionate intensity as he responded, "Don't ask such foolish questions. Just go to sleep." This seemingly abrupt dismissal actually contained the most profound teaching of Gasan's life. In telling his dying teacher to simply sleep, Gasan demonstrated a perfect understanding of what the moment actually required. He refused to engage in elaborate planning for scenarios that might never occur, while neglecting the simple, sacred needs of the immediate situation. The Buddha once proclaimed, "Do not dwell in the past. Do not dream of the future. Concentrate the mind on the present moment." Gasan's response was the embodiment of that truth. Why do we become so entangled in hypothetical concerns that we lose contact with the reality right in front of us? We are often addicted to mental problem solving, believing that if we plan for every possible disaster, we can somehow guarantee control over the future. We treat uncertain futures as problems requiring immediate solutions, when in fact, the most appropriate response to uncertainty is often simple acceptance. We find silence and not knowing uncomfortable, so we generate endless questions to create the illusion of engagement. But what was actually needed in that room was rest, peace, and the acceptance of the natural process of dying. The questions about the temple were irrelevant to the immediate reality of the soul's transition. Gasan's instruction to just go to sleep represents the pinnacle of spiritual direction. It is the recognition that sometimes the most enlightened action is the simplest one. His teacher needed rest. He needed the comfort of the now. All other concerns, however legitimate they might seem in the world of business and administration, were secondary to the immediate reality of life and death. This story reveals the essence of authentic spiritual maturity, the wisdom to know when thinking is helpful and when it becomes an obstacle to appropriate action. Tonight, as you notice your own mind generating endless scenarios about tomorrow, next week, or next year, can you experiment with Gasan's approach? What would it feel like to simply rest in present awareness rather than trying to solve every hypothetical difficulty? As the Buddha taught, peace comes from within. Do not seek it without. This inner peace emerges when we stop trying to control the uncontrollable and instead learn to find rest within the natural flow of arising and passing away. Sometimes the most profound wisdom is contained in 3 simple words. Just go to sleep. As we complete our journey tonight, can you feel how the peace you've been seeking has been quietly present all along?
The wisdom in these ancient stories is not something distant to be acquired, but rather the very awareness that has been listening throughout our time together. Like moonlight uncovering what was always there in the darkness, these tales have simply revealed the clarity of your own heart. Reflect for a moment on the profound path we have walked through these 16 remarkable tales. We saw through the gates of paradise that heaven and hell are states of mind we choose in every moment of reaction. We learned from arresting the stone Buddha that the most difficult problems often yield to creative, unconventional thinking. The soldiers of humanity taught us that true service knows no borders, and Gudo and the Emperor showed us the immense power of the honest words, "I don't know."
We watched the coin of destiny reveal that our beliefs shape the very reality we inhabit, and we were challenged by the teaching on killing to recognize that wasting time is a form of violence against our own potential. Kassan's sweat reminded us that true authority requires the humility to admit when our practice is incomplete, while Buddha's Zen offered us a glimpse into a perception where gold and dust are seen with the same equanimity. We discovered the most valuable thing in the world is that which has no price, and we learned from the 4 students that true silence is an inner quality, not just the absence of noise. The Blockhead Lord showed us that honest, difficult feedback is more precious than easy flattery, and true reformation proved that a silent example can transform a life more deeply than 1,000 lectures.
We learned to say, "Show me your temper," to recognize that we are not our emotional storms. And we saw through the stone mind that carrying heavy concepts only makes our journey more difficult. Real prosperity taught us that the natural order of life is the greatest blessing. And finally, just go to sleep brought us back to the sacredness of the here and now. Each story has been a gentle teacher, showing us that awakening is not a distant goal, but our natural state, temporarily obscured by the very effort we use to find it. Like polishing a mirror that was never actually dirty, these teachings help us recognize the clarity that has always been present within us. The Buddha said, "3 things cannot long remain hidden: the sun, the moon, and the truth." As you continue on your own path, may the truths illuminated tonight remain with you, not as concepts to remember, but as invitations to live with greater presence, compassion, and wisdom. May you carry this stillness into your dreams and awaken refreshed, knowing that the same awareness that listened to these ancient teachings is the very Buddha nature these masters were pointing toward all along. If these stories have brought a sense of quiet to your heart tonight, consider sharing that peace with others, or perhaps leaving a reflection of your own in the comments below. Your journey and your insights are a vital part of this sanctuary we build together. If you wish to return to this place of stillness, feel free to subscribe and join our community of seekers as we continue to explore the mysteries of the mind and the heart. Thank you for sharing this journey with all of us at the night. The night is still, the path is clear, and the wisdom is already within you. May you rest deeply, may you dream peacefully, and may you walk gently in the light of understanding. Just go to sleep. Good night.